Good afternoon, and welcome to our live stream event of the Stations of the Cross. This is generally a Catholic tradition, but last year we decided to try it in a Protestant version. And as I was putting it together, I decided to veer off the traditional path and follow the biblical story, combining readings from all four Gospels to give a complete picture of what happened the night of Passover and the day following. And because of this total picture, I will say now that if there are children watching, Station 6 includes some graphic and disturbing information about the act of crucifixion. And so if you printed the e-bulletin or are reading it on your computer or are just sitting back and listening to us, let's begin this journey together. Good Friday is the most difficult day of the Holy Week. It is a painful path to walk and to hear and to take in. All of the joy and anticipation of Palm Sunday has turned to treachery and betrayal. Judas Iscariot, the disciple who betrayed Jesus, was so overcome with remorse, he hanged himself early Friday morning. Meanwhile, from the moments of Jesus' arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane until the last moment of his life, Jesus suffered. Before he was laid to rest in a borrowed tomb, he was spit upon, abused, beaten, mocked, and tortured. His torture was not only physical in nature, but emotional and spiritual as well. And at 3 p.m., he breathed his last. Why? For us, for all of humanity. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, so that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have everlasting life. As Jesus taught himself, his disciples on more than one occasion, the cross symbolizes something far more profound than suffering and death, and perhaps even more significant than theologies of the atonement. The cross is about faithfulness and servanthood, the commitment to God and to one another that will not abandon that commitment even when rejected. In short, the cross is about the power of love, the commitment of God to humanity, the faithfulness and grace of God that knows no limits and that is without boundaries, that will risk even death itself for the sake of new life. The Stations of the Cross is a liturgical way to reenact that journey as a meditation of worship, an act of devotion to God. To think about the events of Jesus' journey to the cross was a one-time event in history is to misunderstand acting a 2,000-year-old event. We are making our own journey, and in the process, confessing our own dependence upon God. So let's walk together these final hours of Jesus' life as we hear the story and contemplate for our own lives, step by step, until the end.
And hearing to the scripture, it says, following the Last Supper, Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane. And Jesus said to his disciples, sit here while I go yonder and pray. And taking with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, James and John, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then Jesus said to them, my soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me. And going a little further, he fell on his face and he prayed, my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as thou wilt be done. And Jesus came to the disciples and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, "Could you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray, that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." And again, the second time, Jesus went away and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thy will be done." And again, Jesus came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. So leaving them again, he went away and prayed for the third time, saying the same words. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." So it's no accident that Jesus went into the garden for this suffering and prayer when humanity's suffering also began in a garden, the Garden of Eden. Jesus took with him the 3 men who had been with him during the Transfiguration, because Peter, James, and John had seen him in all his glory. They were the ones best equipped to be there to witness the suffering. The words Jesus spoke were ones of dejection, anguish, and horror. The state of mind of someone who's surrounded with sorrows, overwhelmed with miseries, and almost swallowed up with terror and dismay. This is the moment that we see Jesus become truly anxious and extremely stressed. There's a rare condition that's called hematidrosis, which has been recorded that under extreme stress, human beings, in fact, do and can sweat blood. In his prayers, we can hear the most human Jesus, and we can almost hear him beg God not to let the upcoming events happen. It's a rare insight into Jesus' humanity when he prayed that if it possible, the cup might pass from him. But his last words also showed that he was finally ready to carry the load of his sufferings, and that he was willing to be humiliated and beaten and tortured and ultimately killed for our redemption and salvation. If we're to honor the gifts of the cross, then we must remember that life is difficult, that there are bitter cups that we all must drink from, and that we can all fight against it, but that at some time we have to submit to it if we're going to conquer it. Remembering that our lives are in the hands of the one who neither slumbers nor sleeps. Jesus showed us that we all will be tempted, and to avoid temptation, we should watch and pray and continually be reaching for God, not alone, but with the friends who have seen us in the best and the worst of us, friends with whom we share a love for God and a love for each other, and then together we'll be able to say, "Nevertheless, not as I will, but as thy will be done."
Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "The one I shall kiss is the man. Seize him." And Judas came up to Jesus at once and said, "Hail, Master!" And he kissed him. And Jesus said, "Judas, you with a kiss?" Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked the crowd, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am he," Jesus said. When Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. And again he asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they said. Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. If you are looking for me, Then let these men," pointing to his disciples, "let these men go." This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. "I have not lost one of those you gave me." Then they came up and laid hands on Jesus and seized him. And behold, one of those who were with Jesus stretched out his hand and drew his sword and struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear. Then Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? But how then should the scriptures be fulfilled, that it must be so?" At that hour, Jesus said to the crowds, "Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I sat in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But all this has taken place that the scriptures of the prophets may be fulfilled." Then all the disciples abandoned him and fled. A new garden, a new Adam, a new Genesis for God's people is about to take place. In Eden, God came looking for humanity. In Gethsemane, humanity came looking for God, but they didn't even realize it. They had no idea of the part of the plan that they'd play out. They thought they were just doing their job. But unlike Adam and Eve, Jesus didn't hide. He really didn't have any reason to. God had given him a cup to drink from, and he had agreed to drink from it. If we doubt Jesus' divinity at this time, look back at the phrase he uses when they are looking for him. Jesus says, "I am he." I am. The same name God gave to Moses when Moses demanded that God give him a name. I am the resurrection and life. I am the light of the world. And when the soldiers heard it, clearly there was some sort of divine understanding, as they all drew back and fell to the ground. The guards' reactions were the same ones that others had when they met God face to face. This man, standing there in the garden, was the one who for the rest of eternity will be equal with God. And isn't it interesting that Jesus stepped out to them, taking the initiative to begin what is to happen? He's calm. He's in command of the situation, of both his followers and those who have come to arrest him. And so it begins. And as they take him away to Caiaphas, the high priest, we can see irony in that. The true high priest will be sent to his death by the false one. The true Adam, Son of God, will be sent to his death by the false ones. And when this is done, the garden will be restored. And instead of bloodshed and pain, there will be love and healing and forgiveness.
And those who seized Jesus led him to Caiaphas, the high priest of the Jewish temple, where the scribes and the elders had gathered. But Peter followed him at a distance, as far as the courtyard of the high priest, and going inside, he sat with the guards to see the end. Now the chief priests and the whole council sought false testimony against Jesus, that they might put him to death, but they found none, though many false witnesses came forward. At last, two came forward and said, "This man said, I'm able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days." And the high priest stood up and said, Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you?" But Jesus was silent. And the high priest said to him, "I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." And Jesus said to him, "You have said so. But I tell you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." And the high priest tore his robes, and he said, "He has uttered blasphemy. Why do we still need witnesses? You have now heard his blasphemy. What is your judgment?" And they answered, "He deserves death." Then they spat in his face and struck him, and some slapped him, saying, "Prophesy to us, you Christ. Who is it that struck you?" When Judas, his betrayer, saw that Jesus was condemned, he repented and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. He said, "I've sinned by betraying innocent blood." But they said, "What is that to us? See to it yourself." And throwing down the pieces of silver in the temple, he departed, and he went and he hanged himself. But the chief priests, taking the pieces of silver, said, "It's not lawful to put them in the treasury, since they are blood money." After conferring together, they used them to buy the potter's field as a place to bury foreigners. And for this reason, the field has been called the field of blood to this day. Then was fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah, which says, "And they took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of the one on whom a price had been set, on whom some of the people of Israel had set a price, and they gave them for the potter's field as the Lord commanded me." End quote. When day came, the assembly of the elders of the people, both chief priests and scribes, gathered together, and they brought him to the temple council. They said, "If you are the Messiah, tell us." He replied, "If I tell you, you will not believe, and if I question you, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand in the power of God." All of them asked, "Are you then the Son of God?" He said to them, "You say I am." Then they said, "What further testimony do we need? We have heard it ourselves from our own lips." And then the assembly rose as a body and brought Jesus before Pilate. They began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man perverting our nation, forbidding us to pay taxes to the emperor, and saying that he himself is the Messiah, the king." Then Pilate asked him, "Are you king of the Jews?" He answered, "You say so." Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, "I find no basis for an accusation against this man." But they were insistent and said, "He stirs up the people by teaching throughout all of Judea, from Galilee, where he began, even to this place." And when Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him off to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at the time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had been wanting to see him for a long time, because he had heard about him and was hoping to see him perform some sign. Herod questioned him at some length, but Jesus gave him no answer. The chief priests and the scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him. Even Herod, with his soldiers, treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then Herod put an elegant robe on him and sent him back to Pilate. That same day, Herod and Pilate became friends with each other. Before this, they had been enemies. Pilate then called together the chief priests, the leaders, and the people, and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who was perverting the people, and here I have examined him in your presence and have found not found this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither is Herod, for he sent him back to us. Indeed, he has done nothing to deserve death. I will therefore have him flogged and release him." So lies and beating and mockery, misunderstanding, these are just some of the things that Jesus faced after his arrest. The 3 fake trials by the Jewish leaders, followed by 3 mock trials by the Roman leaders. It seemed that no one could really figure out how to close this. The Jewish leaders had waited and plotted for 3 years to catch Jesus, but now they had him, and they still needed the Romans to finish him off. But the Romans saw no harm, nothing that Jesus had said or done against their laws. And for 3 years, they had gone back and forth about this with the Jewish leaders. 3 years of listening to the Jewish leaders lying about him, intentionally misrepresenting him, looking to trap him with every spoken word. And that is true sin. Intentionally breaking from God's will to serve one's own purposes. And the Romans were fed up with this constant power and struggle between themselves and these Jewish leaders. But look at who finally comes together in order to put an end to Jesus, a Jewish king and a Gentile ruler. 2 leaders who have despised each other for years, who on the day that they find a commonality, it is because of the Prince of Peace. A man who had spent 3 years preaching about bringing together Jews and Gentiles, young and old, taxpayers and Samaritans. This man had one last reconciliation. A Jew and a Gentile, both non-believers, Herod and Pilate, reconciling their differences. It's almost as if, when Jesus is around, reconciliation cannot but take place.
Following the Last Supper. After the meal, and when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. Then Jesus said to them, "You will all fall away because of me this night. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee." Peter declared to him, "Though they all fall away because of you, I will never fall away." And Jesus said to him, "Truly I say to you, this very night before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times. Peter said to him, "Even if I must die with you, I will not deny you." And so said all the disciples. And then later that evening, after Jesus had been arrested, now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard, and a maid came up to him and said, "You also were with Jesus the Galilean." But he denied it before them all, saying, "I do not know what you mean." And when he went out to the porch, another maid saw him, and she said to the bystanders, "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth." And being scared for his own life, again he denied it with an oath, "I do not know the man." And after a little while, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, "Certainly you are also one of them, for your accent betrays you." Then Peter began to invoke a curse on himself and to swear, "I do not know the man." And immediately the cock crowed. And Peter remembered the saying of Jesus, "Before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times." And Peter went out and wept bitterly. What must it have felt like to be Jesus at the moment of the Last Supper, when he looked around at the 12 men who had given up everything to follow him, to share in his ministry, to learn all that he had to teach, and to understand that not one, but 2 of them would betray him before the night was over. Judas, he may have understood better. He came from a zealot background and was looking for an uprising to defeat the Roman occupation. But Peter, the one to whom he said, "You are Peter," which means the rock, "and upon this rock I shall build my church." And when he confronted Peter about it, Peter denied it to him face to face. And yet when the time came, he did it anyway. Peter's story is a human story. We want to do good. We know what we need to do. But when we get scared or things go against us, we falter. And we lose our bearings. We cave in to our weaknesses and let them control us. And we separate ourselves from God, which is the definition of sin. And the good news, God loves us through our sinfulness. And when we do err, God doesn't want us to fall into the depths of despair as Judas did. God wants us to come to him, to be embraced in God's love and to reconcile ourselves to that love. After all, God is complete. God created us because God wants to love us, not because God needs us to love him. Peter's story is a human story, and from the cross, we are all forgiven.
Then the Jewish leaders took Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanliness, they did not enter the palace because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man?" "If he were not a criminal," they replied, "we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." "But we have no right to execute anyone," they objected. And this took place to fulfill what Jesus had said about the kind of death that he was going to die. Pilate then went back inside the palace and summoned Jesus and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Is that your own idea?" Jesus asked, "or did others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "Your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. What is it that you've done?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." "You're a king then," said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You say that I'm a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into this world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." "What is truth?" retorted Pilate. With this, he went out again to the Jews gathered there and said, "I find no basis for a charge against him. But it is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of Passover. Do you want me to release the king of the Jews?" And they shouted back, "No, not him. Give us Barabbas." Now Barabbas had taken part in an uprising. And then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they slapped him in the face. Once more Pilate came out and said to the Jews gathered there, "Look, I am bringing him out to you to know that I find no basis for a charge against him." When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, "Crucify! Crucify!" But Pilate answered, "You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." The Jewish leaders insisted, "We have a law, and according to that law, he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God." When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid, and he went back inside the palace. "Where do you come from?" he asked Jesus. But Jesus gave him no answer. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said. "Don't you realize that I have the power to free you or to crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jewish leaders kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat at a place known as the Stone Pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbathana. It was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about noon. "Here is your king," Pilate said to the Jews. But they shouted, "Take him away! Take him away! Crucify him!" "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked. "We have no king but Caesar," the chief priests answered. Finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. So when Pilate saw that he was gaining nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took water and he washed his hands before the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves." So pressure from the masses with a weak leader can be deadly. Pilate was in a tough place. He was doing his job for Rome, and these Jewish leaders were constantly at him about Jesus. When the time came that he was sitting in the judgment seat, his wife came up behind him and said, "Have thou nothing to do with this just man, for I have suffered many things this day in a dream because of him." Pilate knew that Jesus was innocent. He hadn't led a revolt. He hadn't been stirring up dissension, calling people out against Rome. In fact, when pressured to answer a question about how they should treat Rome, Jesus answered clearly. He said, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and render unto God what is God's." Pilate tried to save Jesus, but he didn't have the nerve to do it alone. What if Rome heard about it? So he offers up a deal. Using an old Jewish tradition, he will release one prisoner. Knowing Jesus' popularity, he is sure that Jesus will be released, but he underestimated the cunning of the high priests and the crowds. Those crowds who just 5 days earlier were cheering on their Messiah as he entered into Jerusalem now see him beaten and bloody and looking defeated, and they jump ship and begin crying out, "Free Barabbas!" The crowds chose a murderous rebel who in those days, quote, deserved, end quote, to die, and to exchange him for an innocent man. And from that moment, Pilate, knowing that this is all wrong, literally and figuratively, washes his hands of the matter. But isn't this our dilemma as well? If we're not standing firmly in our belief that Jesus is the Messiah, then we are with Pilate, allowing ourselves to be maneuvered into dangerous compromise. Or are we with the crowds, going along with the masses when things get tough? Or are we with the high priests, pressing forward with a political agenda because we are scared? Or are we with Jesus, standing silently in the middle, continuing to be the bearers of God's love in a confused and sometimes hostile?
Then Pilate released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, delivered him to be crucified. Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the praetorium, and they gathered the whole battalion before him. And they stripped him and put a scarlet robe upon him, and plaiting a crown of thorns, they put it on his head, and put a reed in his right hand. And kneeling before him, they mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they spat upon him, and took the reed and struck him on the head. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the robe, and put his own clothes on him, and led him away to crucify him. A certain man named Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. This story epitomizes the worst of humanity. It is an ugly story, and it is a painful story. To fully understand the sacrifice Jesus made, you must know its details. Oftentimes, because it is so horribly brutal, we skip over the details and are okay with saying, "And they took him out and they crucified him." But to fully feel the joy of Easter, we must feel the pain of Good Friday. The violence against Jesus began shortly after his arrest. A soldier struck Jesus across the face for remaining silent when he questioned by Caiaphas. The palace guards then blindfolded him and mockingly taunted him to identify them as each passed by. They spat upon him and struck him in the face. And throughout the night, he is subjected to these random acts of violence by the Roman guards. Then morning comes, and Pilate orders him to be scourged and released. The Roman flagrum is a short whip consisting of several heavy leather thongs with two small balls of lead attached near the ends of each. The heavy whip is brought down with full force again and again against Jesus' shoulders and backs and legs. And at first, the thongs cut through the skin only. Then, as the blows continue, they cut deeper into the skin, first causing a normal type of bleeding, but after the first few whips, would burst the exposed arteries, causing extensive loss of blood. The small balls of lead made large, deep bruises, which would open by subsequent blows. Finally, the skin of the back is hanging in long ribbons, and the entire area is an unrecognizable mass of torn and bleeding tissue. When it is determined by the centurion in charge that the prisoner is near death, the beating is finally stopped. So finally, the guards tire of this sadistic sport, and they tore the robe from his back that they had put on him. The blood would have dried on his skin by now, so that its removal like this would have caused excruciating pain. But the Roman guards weren't done. Flexible branches covered with long thorns were woven into the shape of a crown, and this was pressed into his scalp. After mocking him and striking him across the face and across the head, driving the thorns deeper into his scalp, The half-fainting Jesus was then untied and probably fell to the ground in agony. The heavy crossbeam was tied across his shoulders, and the procession of the condemned Christ, 2 thieves, and an execution detail of Roman soldiers would have begun its long, slow journey down the Via Dolorosa. In spite of his efforts to walk erect, the weight of the heavy wooden beam, together with the shock produced by copious blood loss, would have been too much. He most likely stumbled and fell. He might have tried to get up, but his body would have been broken beyond its capability. So the centurion, probably anxious to get on with the crucifixion, grabbed an onlooker, Simon of Cyrene, to help carry the cross. It seemed like Simon was known to the gospel writer Mark, who mentions his sons. And later, Paul directs some of his messages to Rufus, a name which was extremely unfamiliar in Palestine. And it is believed that Rufus was a follower. But with Simon, we don't know. But it could be that he was one of the thousands standing, watching the torture and the death of their Messiah. Simon was an unwilling participant in the passion of Christ. Yet he was compelled to pick up the cross. How many times are we asked to help bear the burden of another person in need? Do we see it as an honor? A blessing? We all have our own crosses to bear, making it easy to pretend to not see the needs, the grief, and the suffering around us. It's easy to pretend not to hear the cries for help that come in many forms from those we walk by every day. It's easy to convince ourselves that we're too busy, or too tired, or just have too much on our plates. Well, we need to remember that Jesus said, "Come unto me, all ye who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." And when we yoke ourselves to God, all things are possible.
A great number of the people followed him, and among them were women who were beating their breasts and wailing for him. But Jesus turned to them and he said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For the days are surely coming when they will say, 'Blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed.' Then they will begin to say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if they do this when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?" How amazing is this moment that we hear about. Jesus is on the road to his crucifixion. He's bleeding and in agony. When he sees a group of women following him, already grieving and crying at his impending death, he stops and he talks to them to comfort them. He's moved beyond his own pain and suffering to give comfort to theirs. But the words he says are not the ones that we would expect. Instead, they are prophetic words. Even minutes before he is to be hung on the cross, Jesus is trying to teach and share an important message. This is not the worst of times. The worst is still yet to come. If they do this when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry? If they are treating him, the Prince of Peace, the green wood, this way, what would they do if the Jews rose up and became warriors, dry wood, and declared war on Rome? Ironically, Jesus was dying the death befitting of a revolutionary, even though he was not one. If this is what they were doing to him, a pacifist, what will they do to your sons, he says. This follows along with an earlier prophecy Jesus made when he said, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those who sent to you, how often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing." And now he looks at these women and he mourns for them, for those mothers whose sons may die at the hands of oppressors. And this, in fact, is what happens just about 40 years later when hundreds of thousands of Jews are slaughtered by Rome at the Jewish revolt. And he gives a kind of reverse beatitude. Whereas before he said, "Blessed are the poor, the meek," here he says, "Blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore, because they will not have to feel the overwhelming pain that the mothers will when their own sons are killed."
And when they came to a place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull, they offered him wine to drink, mingled with gall. But when he tasted it, he would not drink it. And as they hung him on the cross, he said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And when the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his clothes and divided them into 4 parts, one for each soldier. They also took his tunic. Now the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from the top. So they said to one another, "Let us not tear it, but cast lots for it to see who will get it." This was to fulfill the scripture, "They divided my clothes among themselves, and for my clothing they cast lots." And that is what the soldiers did. Then they sat down and kept watch over him there. Doesn't it seem that Jesus has suffered enough at this point? It's painful and exhausting to continue to hear about the unnecessary pains that were inflicted upon him. What motivated the Roman soldiers to behave in such a horrid manner? There was no financial gain for them to be dressing him up like a king and pretending to salute him and kneeling down before him. But there was some payback. They had been fighting what we might call rebel terrorists for a long time. Jewish rebels who fought against Rome at every turn. Jews who were desperate for freedom and were ready to do anything. The Roman soldiers probably had had some of their friends die in these battles. They were most likely tired of policing Jerusalem, far away from their homes and their families, and having to deal with these rebel fighters. So when they get someone who has been accused of trying to make himself king of the Jews, and they knew he was going to die anyways, well, maybe they could just have a little fun with him. It's no secret that the ancient ways of fighting and treating enemies was nothing short of brutal. So this treatment of Jesus probably didn't shock many people. His shame and humiliation were made complete with the soldier stripping off of his clothes, although it was normal practice to crucify people naked, and then gambling them away as if he and they were of no importance. But what else happens here? Even in the midst of all this brutality, Jesus reaches out to God and asks for forgiveness for these soldiers. Why? Because they have no idea who he really is. They don't understand that the messianic messenger is in front of them. And if they don't have this divine knowledge, how can they be blamed? If God hasn't offered to them the gift of faith, they clearly cannot be held responsible for not knowing or believing.
And those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "You who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, come down from the cross and save yourself. If you're the Son of God, come down from the cross." So also the chief priests with the scribes and the elders mocked him, saying, "He saved others, but he cannot save himself. Let this Messiah, the King of Israel, let him come down from the cross, and we'll believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God deliver him now, if he desires him. For he said, 'I am the Son of God.'" Pilate had a notice prepared and fastened on the cross. It read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." Many of the Jews read the sign, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and the sign was written in Aramaic and Latin and Greek. And the chief priests of the Jews protested to Pilate, "Don't write the King of the Jews, but that this man claimed to be the King of the Jews." And Pilate answered, "What I have written, I have written." Now, the crucifixion scene was ending just the way that it began, with mockery. And this time it comes from Jewish passers-by, as Golgotha was only about 100 yards outside the city walls where many of us in our church had been. Should the Messiah really be dying at the hands of the Romans? Couldn't the King of all lift himself down from the cross? It seemed like everyone wanted in on the game. And foremost on their mind was Jesus' claim that destroy this temple and I'll raise it again in 3 days. A claim that very few, if any, understood. He couldn't even rescue himself, they say, let alone destroy and rebuild a city in 3 days. But of course, Jesus wasn't talking about the temple, the historic building, which was destroyed, in fact, in 70 AD. Leaving only the western wall that still stands today. He was talking about himself, the fact that he was the temple, the holy place in which God dwelled. And if they destroyed him, he would rise again in 3 days. And he did just that. And as if the public humiliation of arrest and mock trials weren't enough, and as if the physical torture added to it wasn't enough, Pilate thought of one more insult to add, a sign claiming Jesus as the King of the Jews. Now, Pilate didn't really believe that Jesus was the King of the Jews any more than the Jewish leaders did. But it's his final thumb of his nose to them. It's almost as if he were thinking, well, you made me do this, so here is your so-called king. And I will do to any other so-called king you may think about putting forth the same thing I am doing to this one. And by writing it in 3 main languages of the area, he's letting the world know as well. It was a common practice to hang a sign around the neck of a criminal as they walked to their execution to let the community know what the consequence was of a particular crime. This sign instead hung on the cross for all to see, so that all would understand.
Then 2 robbers were crucified with him, one on the right and one on the left. And the robbers who were crucified with him also reviled him in the same way. One of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him. "Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other criminal rebuked him. "Don't you fear God," he said, "since you are under the same sentence? We are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said to Jesus, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus answered him, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." And then there are two robbers, both convicted of real crimes. One joins in the taunting of Jesus, the other does not. It's almost too easy. This death is the same situation Jesus found himself in from the beginning of his ministry. On the one hand, he had those who believed in him, who believed in God, who wanted to learn and live out God's message of love and peace and salvation for all who believe. And on the other hand, those who saw and refused to understand. Those who bowed to the cowardice of bullying and mocking to buoy themselves up. Those who are threatened by love and preferred protecting their own power instead. The true mystery of God's mercy is unveiled in this act of mercy to the repentant thief, just as it was in his conversation with the women, and will be more times before he dies. Even while Jesus was literally dying, he thought about saving this repentant soul and offered him the first place in paradise, in heaven. Imagine that. The first person welcomed into the kingdom of heaven was a convicted felon, a robber, a sinner. If he could be welcomed, so will we.
Meanwhile, standing near the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Cleopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing beside her, he said to his mother, "Woman, here is your son." And then he said to the disciple, "Here is your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her into his own home. An incredibly moving moment between Jesus and his mother. Think back to the moment when the disciples tell Jesus that his mother and brothers and sisters are outside, and he responds, "Who is my mother, my brother, my sisters? Anyone who believes in me is my mother, my brother, my sister." And to some, this is a harsh rejection of his family, but they're wrong. In this moment, Jesus is expanding the concept of family, saying that all who believe are now like mothers and brothers and sisters to each other. But here in this moment, his pure love for his mother shines. He can see her weeping at the base of the cross, and he knows that for a mother, this would be almost unbearable. And after he dies, she is going to be alone, a plight that he does not want to inflict on her. So, as one last gift to each of them, he looks from his mother to his favorite disciple, John, and unites them, knowing that John, just barely out of his teens, would be devastated at his death, and his mother would be broken apart. But together, they could take care of each other. And John does take her into his house, because a widowed woman with no son to support her would eventually die alone and without a thing to their name. And don't forget, Jesus knew the story was not finished, and they would be able to rejoice together on Easter morning and for the rest of their lives.
After this, when Jesus knew all was now finished, he said, in order to fulfill the scripture, "I am thirsty." A jar full of sour wine was standing there. So they put a sponge full of wine on a branch and hyssop and held it to his mouth. When Jesus had received the wine, he said, "It is finished." There are actually two interesting things happening in these last minutes. First, Jesus clearly lets the people around him know that he is thirsty. But isn't he the living water? His first miracle was turning water into wine. So many times in the Bible, he talked about drinking from the living water that is available to anyone who believed in him. They could satisfy their thirst forever simply by believing in him. So did this mean that the rivers of the living water had dried up? Had the water which turned into wedding wine run out for good? Or was there something else going on? He saved others. Could he not save himself? The answer is no. Just like us, God is the only one who could have saved Jesus. But to do so would strip Jesus of his humanity, to discredit all that he had done, walking this earth both as a man and as the Son of God. Jesus at this time is the most human one can be. He is simply thirsty. And what do they have to give him? Nothing but old sour wine, the wine that only the poorest of the poor would drink. Contrast that to the wine of his first miracle when his mother Mary insists he turn water into wine, and not just any wine, high quality wine. He lets them put it in his mouth, one last act of humility, and then he announces publicly that it is finished. And those words are the other interesting thing here. He has finished the work God sent him to earth to do. He has loved until the very end. He has continued to bring people to God, even as he is stumbling down the road, bearing the load of the cross, as well as when he's on the cross. But at that moment, he ends the game. In the original text, the phrase, "it is finished," is actually just one word. It's the same word people wrote on bills after they were paid. The bill is dealt with. It is finished. The price has been paid. And from that moment on, people can stake their lives on the work he has done.
Now, from the 6th hour, there was darkness all over the land until the 9th hour. And about the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" And some of the bystanders hearing it said, "This man is calling Elijah." And one of them at once ran and took a sponge and filled it with vinegar and put it on a reed and gave it to him to drink. But the others said, "Wait, let's see whether Elijah will come and save him." And Jesus cried again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. And behold, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth shook, and the rocks were split, and the tombs were also opened. When the centurion and those who were with him keeping watch over Jesus saw the earthquake and what took place, they were filled with awe and said, "This truly was the Son of God." There were also many women there looking on from afar who had followed Jesus from Galilee, ministering to him, among whom were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of the sons of Zebedee. my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" These are powerful words coming from the mouth of the Son of God, which actually makes them even more heartbreaking. Jesus knew the scriptures, and this is the first line from Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me?" Why are you so far from saving me, so far from the cries of my anguish? There's really no other explanation than understanding that at this moment, and only in this moment in all of his life, the weight of bearing the sins of the world was more than Jesus can handle. It was so heavy that it created a sort of a spiritual cloud between Jesus and God, in which Jesus could no longer see or feel God's presence with him. How lonely and painful that moment had to be. He was a broken man, but God did understand, because as Jesus breathed his last, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth shook and the rocks were split. In short, God's world also broke along with his heart. Geologists have now proved that an earthquake April 3rd in the year 33 of Friday, with its epicenter 13 miles outside of Jerusalem at the Dead Sea. An earthquake large enough to more than 50 miles. An earthquake large enough to let all those who were watching the death of God's Son know that God's heart was breaking as well. God will not forsake us. God is always with us, even when we can't see it, until the end of time.
It was preparation day, that is, the day before the Sabbath. And the Jews did not want the bodies left on the cross during the Sabbath, especially because that Sabbath was a day of great solemnity. So they asked Pilate to have the legs of the crucified men broken and the bodies removed. Then the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and of the other who had been crucified with him. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once blood and water came out. He who saw this has testified, so that you also may believe. His testimony is true, and he knows that he tells the truth. These things occurred so that the scripture might be fulfilled. None of his bones shall be broken. And again, another passage of scripture says, they will look on the one whom they have pierced. After these things, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, though a secret one because of his fear of the Jews, went boldly to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. Pilate was surprised to hear that he was already dead. Summoning the centurion, he asked him if Jesus had already died. And when he learned from the centurion that it was so, he gave the body to Joseph. So Joseph brought some linen, took down the body, wrapped it in the linen shroud. And Nicodemus, who had at first come to Jesus by night, also came, bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, weighing about 100 pounds. They took the body of Jesus and wrapped it with the spices in linen cloths, according to the burial custom of the Jews. Now there was a garden in the place where he was crucified, and in the garden was a new tomb in which no one had ever been laid. And Joseph laid the body in his own tomb, which he had hewn in the rock. And he rolled a great stone to the door of the tomb and departed. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he was laid. And then they went home and prepared spices and perfumes. The gospel writer John is clear when he writes about what happened to Jesus' body after he had died. Can't you imagine that he must have asked himself 1,000 times why he went there? Why he didn't stay in hiding like the others? But within a few days, he knew. He was the witness. He was the one who needed to tell the story of Jesus Christ. And to do it properly and accurately, he needed to be there. He needed to be there because before too long, people would say that Jesus really didn't die on the cross. The story of the resurrection was so mind-blowing that it really didn't fit into many people's worldview. The exception being those who witnessed Jesus resurrect Lazarus and the daughter of Jairus. But consider these facts. The Jews wanted Jesus buried before the Sabbath, as it is against Jewish law to let bodies hang overnight. Pilate hadn't had men crucified for them to be only half dead, so something had to speed up the death. For the two robbers, the solution was simple: break their legs and they would suffocate faster. For Jesus, who was already dead, they decided to stab him with a sword and watch the body fluids run from his body. Only then they pronounced him truly dead. The burial customs of the time were very different from ours. The tombs were caves, hollowed out by hand. This one would have been big enough for 2 or 3 people to walk in, but the doorway would have been small, maybe 4 feet high. To build this was a lot of work. It would be normal for you to have to bury a second body before the first had decomposed. So they wrapped the bodies in white cloth along with large amounts of spices and perfumes. And it's interesting to note that Nicodemus brought about 80 pounds of spices with him in today's measurements, 100 times more than Mary Magdalene had poured over Jesus when she was rebuked by the disciples. In between burials, the tomb would be secured against grave robbers by rolling a large flat stone in a groove in front of the door. John has been here before, waiting outside the tomb while Jesus called for Lazarus to come out. And now here he is again, waiting. But this time, when the tomb opened, the world would never be the same.
Good Friday. Thank you for joining us in this spiritual and very thorough and difficult walk with Jesus during his last hours. It's a very reflective time, very moving time, to say the least. And so we welcome you to take these words and let these words and the actions of Christ and the spirit and all the emotions that you are feeling now and that you'll take with you for the rest of this day. And let them resonate with you, let them touch you, let them move you however they will. And may it continue to provide you with even a greater meaning, and then a joy that we will all once again feel on Easter morning. And we will see you then. God bless you.